Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Asbestos in Brownfield Development technical talk. It's being delivered today by Toby Gibbons. My name is Mel Fox and I'm the Managing Director of RSK Asbestos. Just a couple of housekeeping things first. You are going to be automatically muted for this technical talk today, but if you do have any questions, please use the question box, and at the end of the session we will answer as many questions as possible. And if there are any other questions unanswered, we will circulate the questions and the answers around to everyone afterwards. And you will be sent within an hour of the technical talk a brief survey. We'd love it if you could fill that out for us. That would be great. So I will be handing you over to Toby. So just a bit about him. He's been in the industry now for around 18 years. So I think we can pretty much say he's an expert. And obviously this is all about asbestos in soil, and he has a wealth of experience in that through various works across the Middle East, Central Asia, and of course the UK. So enjoy, and over to you, Toby.
Right, thank you very much. Right, let's get webcams out of the way, and off we go. I'd just like to welcome people to the presentation today. Going to be starting off assuming that most people have got a background knowledge of asbestos in the built environment at some level. No doubt people will have done asbestos awareness courses, so we'll be working in the built environment and the like. So this presentation is going to be focusing strongly on brownfield aspects of asbestos management rather than the built environment. We'll all be familiar with this kind of picture, this kind of material here. Some of these are relatively recent in the UK, some of them are a little bit older, but we're aware of the legacy of industrial use inside the United Kingdom and in other parts of the world. The UK itself, we suffer slightly from the suffer from the benefits, not quite the right term, is it? But suffer from the effects of having used asbestos-containing materials for a long period, quite a lot longer than many other countries around the world. It's a legacy of early industrialisation, early uptake, early use and the like. And of course, it means that the tail on the other end of this, when we're coming out of the use of asbestos-containing materials, is correspondingly longer than it might be in other countries. And you can see this reflected in the mesothelioma stats and the levels of industrial disease related to asbestos exposure. One of the things that we've been coming across more commonly in industry for a period now, I think it's fair to say, when I'd first started in the industry, there were known issues in some areas of brownfield development with asbestos associated particularly with manufacturing, this kind of thing. But by and large, people's focus was on the built environment. We can see this when we look at the control of asbestos regulations, which are focused very strongly on the built environment and indeed the non-domestic aspects of it, etc., etc. Does that mean that asbestos is just a problem in buildings? Well, no, it doesn't. One of the things that we have found as quality of site investigations have improved over the years is that the more you look for asbestos in brownfield sites, the more you find asbestos in brownfield sites. Some of the straw polls around industry say that somewhere between 70 and 90%, 80%, something like this, of all brownfield sites are impacted with asbestos in made ground at some level. And that really can go from the sublime to the ridiculous, from a single cement sheet to some areas which have really almost geological quantities of asbestos present. Couple of reasons for this, which we'll dig into in a little bit more depth. Partly, at least, the legislation in the past wasn't as strict as it was today. It was also common industry practice that here, particularly on heavy industrial sites, if asbestos was removed, it was disposed of on site, it was buried, it was used in building up bunds for earthworks, all this kind of thing. Asbestos wasn't always removed before structures were demolished. This then has the knock-on effect of import of what is apparently clean material onto site, which can have an asbestos content in it, which I'm sure is something that people will have come across from time to time in their everyday works. And we also get the ongoing issues of people using illegitimate disposal routes, fly tipping, disposal of asbestos containing materials by donating them to the local building site or a bit of waste ground or whatever it happens to be. And we still have ongoing issues from contamination of recycled aggregates and the like. When we're talking about asbestos in the ground as opposed to asbestos in buildings and the built environment, there are effectively two sources or 2 areas where that is impacted or brought to the fore, as it were. Question of made ground, of imported fills with less than 0.1% ACM, potentially has a relevance for this, it will come back to later on, or indeed more than that. Poor historic demolition of previously existing buildings on site, import of materials from elsewhere in the country or elsewhere on the site, spreader materials, the like. You also do get the question of geological asbestos, which is something which does occur in the UK. It's not particularly known about or particularly common, but certainly if you're in granite geology, this is something that people should be aware of. And in fact, we had a sample into one of our labs earlier on this week, which was anthophyllite in granite crush from a particular quarry on the island of Ireland. So again, there are geological sources as well as the human sources. There's also the question of historically buried asbestos, either as part of remaindered infrastructure, duct systems, subsurface systems, all the rest of it. Also in the question of deliberate disposal in landfills, in particular hotspots and the like. Exposure events associated with asbestos in the ground tend to occur during site investigations, during development, or potentially by the end users. It's very much the same kind of pattern that you see with asbestos in the built environment, in that in order for there to be exposure, negative health impacts for this, by and large, you need to have some kind of activity which is disturbing the material, raising it to the surface, or indeed raising it into the air, causing elevated fibre levels and potential exposure routes by that means. In common with the built environment, there are different risks associated with asbestos in made ground in brownfield sites. So it's not the case that all of these materials pose the same level of risk. At one end, you have asbestos insulation, loose fill type materials, which are very friable, very high asbestos content, much greater risk of these generating elevated fibre levels. On the other end, you have the question of reinforced composites, and the single biggest use of asbestos in the UK historically was as asbestos composite sheeting and Big 6 type sheeting, which is what almost every farm building from here to wherever you care to look at is made out of. This is something that is recognised and reflected in the legislation. Question of licensing is something that we will come on to later on, but higher risk materials can only usually be worked on by licensed asbestos contractors. Lower risk materials, there are other alternative routes here, although the risks from asbestos should always be assessed appropriately. The other thing which is common in made ground, in brownfield, not in the same way in the built environment, is the question of free fibre. This is something that tends to have arisen over time through physical degradation of asbestos-containing materials, but it's also something that quite commonly comes up as a legacy from manufacturing. I mean, there are various sites around the country where asbestos-containing materials were made, and there's quite an element of contamination by free fibre in the soil on those sites in some instances to this day. There's a different approach to the sampling and analysis of free fibre against visible pieces of ACMs. Notably, you wouldn't expect that free fibres are going to be visible to the naked eye. So this is again one of the things that comes up during site investigation phases relatively commonly, is that much as there may not be any visible asbestos containing material on site, there may nevertheless be an asbestos impact present. Talking about the issues associated with brownfield sites, one of the first occasions that this usually becomes an issue or becomes apparent is during site investigation phases. Again, there's been a great improvement in these over recent history over the years. One of the commonly used techniques in terms of the investigation and classification of the site is to look at the questions of high, medium, low, red, amber, green, traffic lighted type approaches. Slightly oddly, as I was preparing this slide, I did notice that on some occasions these are called red, yellow, green, sometimes they're called red, amber, green, sometimes they're called high, amber, green, etc., etc. Same principles apply. You have some sites which are at much higher risk of having more potentially risky non-bound ACMs present. Manufacturing sites, disposal sites, rail yards, power stations, ship manufacturing, this kind of thing, shipyards. kind of thing that you would expect that is going to be picked up as part of pre-planning, and it is the kind of thing that you would expect to have some impact on site investigation techniques. There's a potential that these sites might be licensable, there's potential that you might need additional support from asbestos consultants or from licensed asbestos removal contractors or similar. Also heightened onus on the idea of control measures of dampening down and so on. One of the take-homes, I guess, from this presentation, I think probably would be, and to a certain extent you would say, I would say this, wouldn't I? I work for an asbestos consultancy, but the earlier engagement from an asbestos consultant in this kind of process, the better the overall outcome tends to be, both in terms of managing work programs through the lifespan of a project, and indeed managing costs and expectations and options associated with that. The earlier that people are involved in this, the more we can usually do to assist. Not to say that we can't assist if things do come up unexpectedly later on in the process. As you might expect, following on from the question of high risk sites or red sites or areas which we may expect that there are likely to be asbestos containing materials present, you have medium risk sites and you have low risk sites. So medium risk sites, effectively any site with a formal industrial use, there is a strong likelihood, I think it's safe to say, that there will be asbestos containing materials present at some level in that. The question of low sites, greenfield sites, I'm always slightly dubious as to whether there are any sites in the UK that could realistically be described as greenfield from the point of view of asbestos. And one of the most classic uses, as I mentioned slightly earlier, would be Big Six type cement sheets, which were very commonly used in agricultural buildings at various different levels. It also reminds me of an occasion a couple of years ago when I was out for a walk with the family on a lovely nature reserve down by the Severn Estuary. Absolutely what you would call a green field, part of a nature reserve, part of a bird watching club, as it were, there at the same time. One of their structures was an old shooting brake, which was built onto the chassis of an old Land Rover, which had asbestos rope as part of the engine compartment. So even where we are talking about sites which have had very low levels of human impact, levels that you might otherwise be using to describe these as greenfield, there is always a possibility that you will have asbestos containing materials present at some level. So if we flip back to the question of the amber red sites and what the kind of mitigations might look like in terms of site investigation phase, and actually these same kind of measures could be applied to development phases as well. You're potentially talking about watching briefs, you're talking about the use of PPE, of RPE, you're talking about dampening down soils, or at least ensuring that soils are maintained damp. I'm aware that we live in the UK and it is quite commonly damp out there, certainly has been over the last couple of days, but if you were to go back a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and this is not necessarily the case, there are some techniques that you would say are probably immediately indicated against. Air flush drilling is a classic one of them. There's also the question of ensuring that inspections are undertaken before ground is broken, making sure that there is appropriate onus on awareness, on making sure that the workforce who are undertaking these works are appropriately trained, equipped, etc., know what the procedures are. Question of PPE and RPE comes into this. We've got a photo there which is from a site investigation that we undertook a couple of years ago. One of the things that you can see there, people will be familiar with type 5-6, category 3 overalls, your paper suits, etc., using simple things as blue rather than white coloured suits on these can make people a lot less visible from the point of view of concerned local residents, etc. Makes you look a little bit less like CSI, and people tend to ask where the body is buried a little bit less on that basis. Blue blends into the background. Similarly, RPE, appropriately fitted, appropriate filters, etc. And a question of footwear. And again, expanding that view a little bit. Now, this is a red site. The site in particular here is very much at the red end of red, so hence the uplifted levels of control measures and monitoring that are in place here. But just to show that these are things that are used in real life and are manageable. They are procedures that we should be looking to follow. Mentioned question of take-homes earlier on. I think this is probably the other main take-home that I'd like to bring forward if we can. If there's one thing that people do get from this, the question of appropriate sampling techniques is one of them. There are effectively two different sampling techniques used when we're talking about asbestos in the built environment and in brownfield. The first one is the one that people, I suppose, would probably be more immediately familiar with, question of bulk sampling. It's where a visible piece of a suspect material are collected from site, and that can be a site as in a building, it can be a site as in a brownfield construction site or similar, and these are submitted to an asbestos accredited lab, which would undertake bulk sample analysis, and they determine the product type and which kind of asbestos material is present. Now, it's important to note that that is for visible pieces of suspect material. The second item that we have in there is the question of soil quantification, whereby a soil sample is taken with or without visible ACMs being present and subject to analysis again by a UCAS accredited laboratory. Limited detection is low on these. It's possible to detect a very, very low level of asbestos content, possibly at a level where it's not realistically going to be causing any enormous impact onto site works, but also commonly in a manner which can give us very useful information. The reason I say that it's important to differentiate between these two items here is you do commonly come across in site investigations occasions where people will have noted the presence of asbestos at 2.8 meters BGL or whatever it happens to be, but not necessarily taken a sample of the bulk material. Now, the issue with that, and the issue that we face when it comes to looking at the question of brownfield development, is that that gives you an incomplete picture of what you need to know. Okay, it tells you that there is some kind of asbestos containing material there, but it doesn't tell you how much, it doesn't tell you which form it's in, it therefore doesn't tell you what appropriate methods could be used to deal with this, and so on and so forth. The other thing that can happen quite commonly is when some of the soil labs undertake analysis of samples, they will quantify at 0.01% weight for weight, whatever it happens to be, and add a reported comment onto the certificate that says asbestos insulating board or says asbestos insulation or something like this. Now, there are potentially unforeseen consequences of that, which we'll come on to shortly when it comes to the question of licensing. It's something to be aware of, and I guess the question is for people who are commissioning site investigations, who are undertaking development, who are going forward to planning and the like, is to make sure that you're asking the right questions, the right kind of analysis to the right people at the right time. Can really be critical to make sure that we get the right answer to allow the developments to be undertaken in an appropriate manner. The other thing that I suppose is in there is the question of asbestos behaving in a slightly different manner to many of your traditional contaminants in terms of hydrocarbons or metals or the like, in that asbestos doesn't form horizons and plumes in quite the same kind of manner, tends to stay largely where it was put, either deliberately or inadvertently. Mentioned the question of training as an absolutely critical part of works with asbestos impacted soils. Realistically, I think we should be expecting that in the same way that anybody who's working in the built environment should have asbestos awareness training as a bare minimum, anybody who's working in brownfield sites should have asbestos awareness targeted for ground workers as a minimum measure to ensure that they're able to assess works appropriately. There are also other levels that go in there in terms of licensed or indeed non-licensed training for ground workers. There are bespoke trainings that can be put together for specific sites, question of face fitting, etc. as well, which all goes into that kind of aspect. Questions of licensable work in the soil, much the same as they are in the built environment in broad terms. You have higher risk activities, licensable works, which works on asbestos insulating board, insulations, coatings, or debris arrived from the above, or works which are liable to breach a control limit. You have non-licensable works which are outside of that, and just because the HSE like to have 3 categories if you get the chance, or 4 if 3 aren't good enough, or 5 if etc., you have this middle category of notifiable non-licensed work. It's slightly difficult to see how the question of notifiable non-licensed work might fit into the ground, but that's a different argument to a certain extent. In the same way that works in the built environment might fall under the licensing regime, works on soil, brownfield sites, C&D materials, made ground, etc., can disturb asbestos, can remove asbestos, and can also be considered under the licensing regime. I have some examples of this here, from ground improvement operations to production of recycled aggregate to demolition of substructures, etc. Remediation, construction in broad terms. The question of ACMs in the made ground. Now, we started off the presentation with some slides which dealt with the question of ACMs in the built environment, and they're the things that people classically come across as part of asbestos awareness training, textured coatings, asbestos insulating board, ceiling tiles, asbestos insulations, etc., etc. Now, any of those materials can make their way into the ground, indeed do make their way into the ground through a variety of different means as described previously. We've got some examples here of what these might look at, going from shuttering on a pour of concrete to insulation materials to pieces of cement type materials mixed in with many other items. It's important to note that the appearance of some of these items in the made ground can be quite different from the appearance of these items in the built environment. One of the things that it's always important to consider is the competency of people who are undertaking works, whether that's consultancy works, whether it's site investigation works, whether it's earthworks as part of a development, whether it's whatever they happen to be. And it's important to consider, if we are talking about ACMs in the made ground, that the way that they present themselves is not necessarily typical of the way that they would have presented in their original form in the built environment. You can see that from the bottom image there in particular, some of these items can be really quite fragmented and small. The question of whether asbestos containing materials are visible on site is a pertinent one, because it goes towards the determination of whether a waste arising may be hazardous or not. It's also very important to check the competency of anybody you are employing, or any of your contractors, subcontractors or similar who are undertaking works of this kind, checking that people are familiar with working with asbestos containing materials in made ground as opposed to solely in the built environment. It is the case that the presence of asbestos containing materials on site are going to affect options appraisals. It's going to affect an options appraisal with regard to the end use, with regard to the potential development routes, with regard to the potential treatment options for other contaminants there. Broadly speaking, they're the same kind of management options in place as you might expect in the built environment in any case. There's a question of leaving asbestos in situ. There's a question of removing asbestos from the soil and treating, or from the made ground and dealing with them separately. And there's a question of bulk removal of asbestos, including made ground. It can be possible to reuse materials on site with appropriate controls in place. It can be possible to treat on site or indeed off site. I mentioned briefly the question of whether materials are visible or not. This is the relevance of that realistically is that if you have a fibre content of more than 0.1% weight for weight, then a made ground is going to be, or waste rather, being disposed is going to be considered as a hazardous waste from the point of view of asbestos alone. There may be other contaminants in there as well, of course. Or indeed, if there are visible asbestos containing materials in a waste, that is going to fall as a hazardous waste under the hazardous waste regulations. If we're looking at the question of leaving materials in situ, you need to consider the works that are going to be proposed. You need to consider the end use of the land. There are occasions where it would not be appropriate to leave asbestos containing materials in situ, public open spaces, residential gardens, this kind of thing. There are other occasions, particularly if we're talking about major infrastructure projects, this kind of thing, where it may be entirely appropriate to leave ACMs in situ, and maintain them where they are. Can be appropriate to look at the question of capping layers, including visual warnings, hard to dig layers, etc. The important bit that falls in here, or the most important bit that falls in here, I guess, is the question of making sure that we have consents from various people to ensure that this can be undertaken, and to ensure that all areas of known asbestos, unknown asbestos, what is being left on site, etc., is documented through an asbestos management plan, or there are other ways of doing this. If we're talking about the question of separating asbestos from soils, there's various different methods that can be used here, going from hand picking of visible materials to mechanical separation, riddling with appropriate controls in place can be used, etc. This can be of use, particularly where we are talking about, again, the absolute classic contaminant of asbestos cement in soils. It's relatively achievable to get those pieces of cement from the soil, and either to drive down the overall risk associated with the soil, or indeed potentially to reduce the amount of waste that is going as hazardous waste and allow for more appropriate streaming of these materials. It is also the case that it is more time consuming to hand pick materials or to mechanically separate materials than it is to undertake straightforward excavation. And it's also the case that it's not an appropriate method for some materials, particularly the higher risk licensable materials, where you have a much more friable, much more loosely bonded material. Riddling, certainly unlikely to remove that from the soil. Hand picking, very also unlikely to remove all asbestos from the soil, although it could be of use to remove some of the bulk content and allow for easier management of the remaindered fibre content. The other option is the one which gets referred to as dig and dump commonly. It's certainly the quickest option, but it can also be the most expensive, and you do then reach the question of, okay, well, what do we do after we have dug the asbestos and impacted ground from the site itself? Where's it going to go? It's worth bearing in mind the question of remediation of landfill and the like, and the fact that quite an amount of the asbestos impact in made ground in the UK is associated with previous disposal, and each round of disposal effectively acts to dilute the waste in some manner. Even if we were talking about inadvertent mixing of capping layers or something like that, you end up with a lower content but larger volume of waste. So at some point, and there are various thoughts around this one in industry in broad terms at the moment, there is a question of end of life of asbestos product. We're not at that point at this moment. Is dig and dump an appropriate way to deal with an impact on a particular site? Well, yes, it can be, but it certainly shouldn't be the immediate go-to. There are other options in there as well. Control measures during remediation, in any case, in the same kind of way that we'd expect there to be control measures during remediation, removal or abatement of asbestos-containing materials in the built environment. So you would expect there to be similar in the brownfield context. You wouldn't necessarily expect enclosures to be used, although on some occasions where we've got pieces of retained estate that might be appropriate, but you'd certainly be looking at control of works. You'd be looking at working in accordance with CAR 2012 and so on. Controlled entry exit points, decontamination of equipment, question of monitoring, perimeter monitoring, high volume perimeter monitoring, potentially looking at driving down limits of detection, etc. And question of concerned or sensitive receptors in surrounding area, again, is something to be strongly considered there. Final couple of points, really, not one that I necessarily thought illustrating by slides is going to be the way to go forward, but looking at the question of consequences of failure to consider asbestos-containing materials on site during development as part of brownfield investigations, etc., etc. Because of the nature of the materials, because we know that they are liable to be present at some level in a large number of brownfield sites, it is quite possible for programs to be put in place at the beginning of a development which are not necessarily taking into account all the potential consequences of later discovery of asbestos-containing materials, being worked on, or asbestos-impacted soils being worked on in a manner which causes a spread, for example. And it's entirely possible, leaving aside the obvious legal and indeed moral consequences for the financial consequences to be quite considerable. If you think about the question of a waste material being classed as a hazardous waste material, if it has a visible asbestos content to it, it's quite easy to see how a stockpile of crushed material or a stockpile of made ground or of whatever it happens to be can turn quite quickly into a stockpile of what is potentially waste material and what is potentially a hazardous waste material because of the asbestos content there, and the costs can increase really quite quickly on that. We've certainly been involved ourselves as an organisation in cases where there are multiple thousands of cube of waste material to be dealt with, and the financial consequences of that one are quite considerable, as we might expect, and as I'm sure people recognise. It goes back again to the question I think I raised really quite early on in the presentation of early engagement, of consultation, of getting the right kind of level of advice at the right kind of point in the process allows for better planning, better outcomes financially, legally, etc., and for all parties. Well, that's a bit of a gallop through the subject. We're happy to take any questions and attempt to answer them, at least that arise from that. Included a quick list of guidance there, and indeed some contact details. And at that point, I shall hand back to Mel, who hopefully has some questions for us.
Thank you, Toby. That was lovely.
There we go, back again.
I do have a couple of questions for you. I know that a couple of the bits were picked up during your presentation, but I think maybe you just need to clarify a couple of points. So somebody has asked, do you always have to remove asbestos from a site when you find it?
No, you don't. Simple answer to that one. It's going to depend quite largely on what the phase of development is, on which kind of asbestos containing material we may have found here, or indeed whether we are talking about free fibres in soil. It is the kind of thing which can be managed as part of a development process to either allow for materials to be retained on some areas of site or indeed all areas of site, and it is entirely possible that you would get a different approach on different areas of site. If we were talking about a housing development, for the sake of argument, residential gardens, we would, I think, be all happy to say that we shouldn't be leaving asbestos containing materials or impacted soil at any level at the surface. However, if we were talking about the same site at depth below foundations or potentially roads or parking or similar, then it may well be entirely appropriate, with appropriate permissions in place, to maintain materials on site.
Lovely. And another question, someone's had a site investigation done and 2 of the samples came back with chrysotile containing board.
Okay.
They want to know if their further groundworks are going to be classed as licensable.
So I guess there's a couple of items in there. It does, to a certain extent, go back to this question of what kind of analysis has been undertaken here, whether we are talking about bulk samples, whether we are talking about quantification, what the quantifications are. But again, quite largely, it is going to depend on what is actually happening on site. Now, if we are talking about a large site that has had 1,000 trial pits on it, and there are these 2 isolated areas which have chrysotile containing board identified in them, assuming that absorption testing has been undertaken and this is indeed board rather than cement, it may be possible to deal with those as isolated hotspots. It is entirely possible that if this is a chrysotile board material, it would be licensed. It would need a licensed contractor to deal with it. It's also the kind of thing that if you were talking about a smaller site, and in fact there are only 2 trial pits, I know 2 is quite a small number for them for a trial pit, if there were 2 trial pits, both of which have returned a positive result with chrysotile board in them, you might in fact be talking about using licensing the entire site, and all works in the ground that are disturbing that material may at that point be licensable. Conversely, if it is a much larger site, these might be hot spotted and removed, but with potentially an upgraded an increased onus on awareness training and ensuring that emergency procedures and the like are in place. And one of the things that we do find quite commonly is that leaving aside the geological sources, which you do get geological sources. Asbestos containing materials don't fall from the sky. They've arrived on site at some point because of human interaction, and once there are some asbestos containing materials present, identified, analysed, etc., it does to a certain extent increase the likelihood that there are going to be more there at some level.
Okay, and another interesting question. Are we obliged to hold a risk register for sites that have possible or known ACMs buried in them? For example, would be a World War II airfield like Stansted.
So there's not a duty to manage asbestos in the soil in the same way that there is a duty to manage asbestos in the built environment and non-domestic premises, driven by regulation for the control of asbestos regulations. So in terms of there being a driver to say you should undertake a management survey or the equivalent of this site in the absence of any other disturbance, when we're talking about the ground rather than the buildings, then no. However, if you are talking about planning of remediation works, development works, site investigation works, something like this, it is certainly something that should be included as part of the risk assessment. And you do get this principles of traffic lighting again, sites like Stansted, where you have got historic uses, or another airport, I don't like to point fingers, do I? Where you've got historic usage, you've got materials on site which have been asbestos containing, you've got hangars, you've got potential for historic airframes. There was certainly a tendency going back to past times of airport or airfield users, if they had an airframe that was too damaged to use, to effectively drag it to the side of the runway and light it on fire, bury it where it was. So again, you are looking at a site there realistically which is towards the amber, maybe into the red sort of categorization there, but there's nothing outside of the development context that's going to immediately say, oh no, this should be a national register or a risk register or something like that. It's not quite the same driver as it is with management of asbestos in non-domestic premises.
Okay, well, I think that wraps up all of our questions. If anyone does have any more, then feel free to send them over using those contact details, and we'll do our best to answer anything and help any way we can. But thank you very much for your time today. The session has been recorded and it will be available via link. If you can fill in the feedback survey that will be sent to you after this, that would be great. And just so you know, the next technical talk topic is on PAS 2035 and the challenges of decarbonising housing stock, and that will be on Thursday the 13th of October with Bethan Barclay, and it will be moderated by Rachel Y. So if you can join us for that one as well, that would be great. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.